Okay, thank you, Meredith, and thank you, Jeremy, for the introduction. This is my first time presenting with the Terrestrial Ecosystems Group. I did present when IARPC first started. There was a working group that was specific to fire or tundra fire that I did present at, and that was probably 5 years ago now. I think you can see my screen, and I can't tell actually if you can see my full screen. It looks like it's getting cut off at the bottom, but we'll go with that. So what I want to do is talk with you about the Integrated Ecosystem Model, and we abbreviate that as IEM, and I'll introduce myself first, and then the IEM and some of our research that we've done as part of this project, and then applications to more management questions, and then our plans to create a web app, an IEM web app. So we're currently soliciting input on the design of this app, and we're sending out a survey in the next few weeks to get some input in terms of priorities, what sort of information the community would like to see in the web app. Because we can't do it all, but we want to have a starting point and then a priority list for what we add over time. So as I'm speaking, my goal is to give an overview of the IEM, and I ask that the audience follow up with questions or during this call, or just get in touch with me as well. You send me an email. So I am open to further discussion beyond what I can do in an overview. So as Jeremy shared, I am at University of Alaska Fairbanks, and this work has been funded by the Alaska Climate Adaptation Science Center, so USGS, and then there's also been, over the years that we've been working on this project, there have been funds that have come from the landscape conservation cooperatives in Alaska. So our acknowledgement list is quite long of those who have participated in the project. We had a pilot phase of phase 1, and we're now in phase 2. So this has been an ongoing project. And we've had others like Mark Lara, who's at University of Illinois, who was with us as a postdoc, and he's continuing to work with us now that he's moved on to a tenure-track position. So just a little bit about myself to give my background. I grew up in New England. I'm originally from Connecticut, and I did my bachelor's in Maine at College Bay Atlantic, and then my master's work was actually at the University of Missouri, but I was working in the Alpine in Colorado. So I've had an interest in Alpine and Arctic systems since I was an undergrad, and my first experience working in the Alpine was at University of Colorado at the LTR site. I was an REU student, and then worked in Colorado and actually more eco-hydrology work at that time, studying drought and its influence on plant-pollinator interactions. And after my master's, I came up to Alaska as a research technician working in Skip and Marilyn Walker's lab on the ITEX project at Toolik Lake. And I ended up staying on for my PhD in Alaska, and then my postdoc, and now within now research faculty within IARC. I put together these photos, and I'm a big fan of scrunchies. I'll just put that out there. And very happy that they've come back in style. I suppose it depends on the generation, but scrunchies are a thing again. And some of you may not even know what a scrunchie is, but my braid on the right, I have a scrunchie at the bottom of each. In terms of my research interests, I think I was introduced as a plant ecologist, which is definitely correct. Plant ecology and evolution is my background. My expertise is largely in Arctic and Alpine regions, and it's in ecology and evolution, and then more specifically vegetation ecology and the characterization of vegetation communities and the responses to climate-driven disturbances. So I have done work studying tundra fire, for example. My current projects, I have this image here. This is showing changes in vegetation in a drained lake basin. This is near ARCUS, this particular drained lake basin. It's called Brewer Basin. I have 3 main projects I'm working on. So there's the IEM, and then there's also work with NG Arctic, Department of Energy funded project, and then 2 NSF funded projects studying disturbance. And I'm studying drained lake basins with a project that's led by Ben Jones and Chris Arp. And we have a chronosequence of sites that differ in their time since lake draining. And then we also have a new project that's led by Skip Walker, that's NNA with NSF. And we're studying ice-rich permafrost systems and the influence of infrastructure on those systems. And we're working at Prudhoe Bay in the oil fields and also in the community of Point Lay. And more recently, I am no longer in Fairbanks. I am living in Palmer, north of Anchorage, and I'm at the USGS Alaska Climate Adaptation Science Center. So Jeremy's office is right next to mine. I'm still in a role at UAF and IARC. That's still where my position is based. And I'm part of SNAP, which is the Scenarios Network for Arctic and Alaska Planning that's led by Scott Rupp. And I'm more of a liaison with the community in Anchorage, in my position being here as compared to Fairbanks, because we do work with state and federal agencies, and having a person here in Anchorage has been beneficial for our institute. I really enjoy the backcountry. This is just a photo of my husband and I in the valley where we live in the Connect River. What I'm wearing there is called a nose hat. And we often ski, run, I actually snowshoe run, and fat bike. So this is us here with our fat bikes. And one of my goals for this next year is to ride my fat bike to Nome on the Iditarod Trail. So now getting into the IEM. So what is it? I recognize some of the names that are of the people who are on the call, and I don't think there's anyone specifically who's worked with us with the IEM. I have done some presentations over the years at Arctic Science Summit Week, at AGU related to the IEM. So what it is it's an effort that was developed from discussions with the Science Center and then our Alaska Landscape Conservation Cooperatives, and really came out of an effort that was led by the Arctic LCC, this Wildlife Response to Environmental Arctic Change. And their goal was to better understand and predict the future habitats in Arctic Alaska. So this is falling under U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and they're specifically interested in wildlife habitat. So the working groups agreed that they wanted to take this approach to understanding the biological and physical processes that drive terrestrial and aquatic ecosystem function and the response to those changes. And at UAF, we had disparate groups that were working with models that were specific to different aspects of the ecosystem, and with the IEM, we're bringing those together as a coupled model. So we look at it as a decision support tool to aid in understanding the nature and rate of landscape change and how landscapes, it is primarily a terrestrial model. I'll put that out there. So how landscapes are expected to respond to climate-driven changes in vegetation disturbance. And disturbance here is wildfire and also thermokarst. So any disturbance associated with permafrost thaw, hydrology and permafrost soils dynamics as well. And we also provide an understanding of the level of uncertainty and expected outcomes. So the IEM specifically is targeted at the management community in Alaska, and coming out of the Arctic LCC, their objective to have a better understanding of future landscapes. Our model geographic domain in this image on the right, it's shown in red. So we do include all of Alaska, and we do go into Canada as well, so transboundary. And this is largely derived from the LCC, which are also, I think, bird management units. I'm not sure if I have that term quite right, but for North America. So they're associated with habitat as well. So from Alaska into Northwest Canada, and this image is coming out of a paper that's been accepted in Frontiers in Ecology and Evolution that's focused on the Arctic region and actually also is targeted at co-production within the IEM project, since we're working with the LCCs to really develop this model. Part of that project, or sorry, part of that effort for that paper, we were focused on the Nuiqsut traditional use area. So it's part of a special issue coming out of the EBSCOR project, and Nuiqsut is one of their areas where they've been working in their last phase. So in terms of the IEM, our process, we have scenario development at the top, and we have our climate inputs. And then we have vegetation, disturbance, permafrost hydrology. And I'll put these out here. I don't want to get into the specifics, but they're models that you're likely familiar with vegetation and wildfire. We're working with Alfresco, which was developed by Scott Rupp, working with Terry Chapin. And that specifically includes both fire and then vegetation response, and that is applied across our full domain. And then biogeochemistry coming out of the terrestrial ecosystem model that Dave McGuire developed, and we have Eugenie Kirkton and Alain Jeanette working on that side of things. And then the permafrost model is Vladimir Romanowski's GIPL, the Geophysical Institute Permafrost Labs model. And hydrology sort of is within all of these models to some extent with soil moisture. And we also have a specific thermokarst model that we're developing. And that is Bob Bolton in the Arctic region who is working on that, and Alain Jeanette in the interior of Alaska. And that includes hydrology and changes such as catastrophic lake drainage and how that influences thermokarst. So we do have this co-production model in which we apply the model outputs to management decisions, and then there's this communication of needs and context, and it's somewhat reciprocal in our goal to listen to what is needed within the management community and to make changes. Sometimes we have outputs from the model that simply can be interpreted in ways that we haven't thought about before. Talking with a caribou biologist, for example, like for understanding habitat and what might be important for caribou habitat. And when we're looking at something like caribou habitat, that's what we call a secondary impact model. And that also is part of this iterative process for really understanding how we can improve our model for use for questions such as changes in habitat over time. So this is an image just looking at the coupled nature of disturbance, biogeochemistry, permafrost, vegetation, hydrology, of course, as well. When we put this together for our FEE paper, we wanted to do something different, and we hadn't seen previously one of these ecosystem processes, conceptual models that had both the growing season and the snow season, because we are working across the full, with annual outputs, monthly outputs, and we are across the full seasonality. And some of the issues that we've addressed beyond something like caribou habitat is tree line expansion. This is something that's within Alfresco, and specifically expansion of spruce at tree line in the Arctic and Alpine, and that's work that I've done. Changes in shrub distribution, and then with the thermokarst model, things like ice wedge degradation and active layer deepening. So some of you may be familiar with the SNAP scenarios network for Arctic and Alaska planning with our, so someone just joined perhaps, and okay, there, it just got quiet. I was just gonna say to put yourself on mute. SNAP provides dynamically downscaled climate data that is how we drive the IEM, and we often do good questions about how those data were selected. For the CMIP5 climate models, for the IEM, we work actually just with 2 of these models that are at the 2 extremes. And for CMIP5, John Walsh was lead author on a paper that describes our downscaling method, and then we also have model selection that can be viewed at the SNAP website to understand how this process, how our methods and how we selected what we refer to as the 5 best performing models for the Arctic and for the Alaska region. And from those 5 best models, we selected 2, and one is a warmer and drier at the extreme where we see the most fire occurring. And then we have a cooler and wetter model that's at the other extreme where we see the least fire occurring in our model. And that's generally how we bound our projections. So how are the projections summarized? There are maps, graphs, tables for chosen areas of interest, and I'll show a few of these. So a graph here, this is growing season climate. Most of the summaries I'll show you are specific to LCC regions. So this is for Northwest Boreal LCC. This is one way of summarizing growing season climate. So this is monthly mean precipitation, and our two models, and the wetter and colder is shown in blue, and then the warmer and drier is shown in red, and that's the MRI, CG, CM3, and then the NCAR model. And we have it in relation to the historical, the crew data for the region as well. So that's the climate research unit. And this is one way of looking at both the variability annually and then also decadally. So the lines that are finer are annual, and then decadal variability are the bolder lines. And this is mean monthly temperature, also from 2010 through 2100 for the growing season as well. So this is just one way that we've summarized these data. And this was part of the Alaska carbon assessment that David McGuire led. Just to put this out there. Projections for wildfire, looking specifically at annual area burned. This is a graph that we use to show the dynamics from the start of our historical period, which we use as 1950, and then at 2010 actually is where we changed to projected, the projected, where we're changing from using historical to the CMIP5 driving data, and looking at variability in area burned. And this again is for Northwest Boreal LCC for our 2 models, a simulated historical, and then this shows somewhat of the how well our simulated historical matches the historical as well. Other projections, vegetation change. This is for Northwest Boreal. One of the factors that we're specifically interested in the interior is the dynamics of white spruce or I should say spruce versus deciduous. So the coniferous to deciduous ratio and how that changes over time with projected changes in wildfire. So on the left, we're looking specifically at white spruce forest, and then on the right, I have black spruce and deciduous forest, and showing the historical, and then this is actually all 5 of the models that we use at UAF and with SNAP and with the IEM project, and uncertainty that surrounds those. Something else that we've done, I mentioned Dave McGuire and his work with the Alaska Carbon Assessment that was led by USGS. And I should say that Dave was the original PI on this project, and when he retired, I took on that role as the lead for the project. So a lot of this is coming out of Dave's work, at least his guidance as the lead for the project. And I really should have said that with the acknowledgements, that the leads were Dave McGuire, Scott Rupp, Vladimir Romanowski, and it's very hard to have these individuals be moving toward retirement and to be stepping up, because it's very hard to consider filling their shoes, which I don't think we can do, but we'll come into our own. And now we're more in this position of still working with Scott and Vladimir, but it's myself, Bob Bolton at UAF, and I are Eugenie Skirkin and Ellen Jeanette and Dmitry Nikolowski and Sergey within the permafrost group. So this is a figure that we included in this FEE paper as well, looking at carbon dynamics, and this is specific to the Arctic LTC. So a comparison of the historical to our projections, and one way of summarizing these data. This was work that Ellen had done, and with the arrows, we show the changes from the historical to the projections. So for example, for atmospheric CO2 in the historical period, we were at 378 parts per million, and if we're summarizing over the projected period, not quite doubled, but up to 684 parts per million, and then there's some variability around that. And changes in terms of the annual air temperature, precipitation, and area burned. So quite a bit more area burned as well. So research applications, we have just a few case studies that we've put out there. This is coming from an executive summary that we put together. We've applied the IEM to a Department of Defense project that was led by Ted Schur, and that was fire suppression on military lands in interior Alaska. And the military was specifically interested in suppression and how that would influence the amount of annual area burned, and I'll actually show the results from that in a moment. We found in general that suppression did not decrease the area burned, and there was a larger difference with the two models that we bound the IEM by. And then I mentioned this, the Alaska carbon assessment is another application, so I won't go too much into that. By the numbers, we've had 30 people involved in the project, plus, and that includes graduate students and postdocs that have been with us and then moved on. Various publications, presentations at conferences, also working with the public and stakeholders. And these are just two of the papers that have come out, and I hope you can see that okay on your screens. I know it's somewhat small, but coming out of the Permafrost Lab, using the ecosystem type approach to model permafrost dynamics, and that was led by Dmitry Nikolowski, and then a paper that Eugenie led that's looking at consequences or changes in vegetation and snow for climate feedbacks. And then at the bottom, in terms of outreach, we did have an interview that was on Alaska Public Media about the IEM. Research applications again, and these are more specific to habitat. So there has been some work, and it's been wildfire specifically in climate on caribou and moose habitat. And one was led by Kyle Jolly, and this was part of his PhD work working with Scott Rupp, and changes in specifically the influence of wildfire on their winter forage, which is lichen, and getting a better understanding of recovery and how that influences caribou populations. And then also working not just in, so on the left, Kyle Jolly's work was focused on Western Alaska and the Western Arctic caribou herd, and then Dave Gustine, who had been with USGS, working with him, Todd Brinkman led this effort out of SNAP, changes in wildfire and its effect on habitat in the Alaska, Yukon Arctic. So it's more eastern, getting into Northwest Canada and going across the boundary between the Arctic and the interior, and changes in winter range. So that figure at the bottom, the graph is showing the caribou winter range, the historic, and the anticipated changes in that availability with 2 models, and those are actually the CMIP5 models that we were using. So applications outside the project, we are using the IEM or parts of it for work with NG Arctic. CERDIP, I touched on that with the Department of Defense, our work modeling fire suppression, and this figure is showing our 2 models and fire management, the different fire management, why is the term not coming to me? Various efforts at suppression. So given our current fire management planning option, that's what that is. So giving the current and then an alternate where we increase fire suppression and its influence on the annual area burned. And our 2 models are shown in red and blue, and then the solid line is the current fire management planning option, and then if we were to suppress, it's shown as a dashed line. And I don't know if my pointer actually shows up, but we're looking at historical. There is this big jump, and this is real. This is 2015, the year in which we had large wildfires burning in interior Alaska, our largest year on record. So that jump is accurate because we're going through the historical here. So we have that jump and then this divergence about 2030 between the 2 models. And there's really, the difference between the 2 models is really what shows up more so than fire suppression. So fire suppression doesn't have a large effect on the amount of forest that burns, because eventually it just burns. It's not something that can be suppressed over time. And that contributed to Ted Scher's chapter that was in the second state of the carbon cycle report, the Arctic and boreal carbon chapter. We've also worked with BLM with their rapid ecoregional assessments and the Permafrost Carbon Research Coordination Network with the interior LTR, Bonanza Creek and Caribou Poker Flats. Also the EBSCOR Northern Test Case, which is Nuiqsut, which I was referring to that SEE article. And there's been other applications as well, but those are just some of the main ones. If you want to access our IEM products, they are available. They're on the SNAP CCAN data portal, and they encompass the full geographic domain. They're GeoTIFF files, and they have metadata as well. The sort of inputs to the model that are available are those that we serve up climate data through SNAP, but then also that we've derived specifically for the project. And these are all at 800-meter resolution. So radiation, vapor pressure, elevation, slope. This image here is showing land cover, which is something that we put together ourselves. It's a modeled land cover input that's coming from the North America climate NACOMs. So it's coming out of this North America effort to understand vegetation change. And this is really what we had to use as we went into Northwest Canada. And I'm sure many of you know this, especially with above, as you cross this boundary from the US into Canada, there are not data sets that typically span this boundary. So we had to use this North America approach. And in that original data that's made available, there are things like coniferous forests, that are not separated into black and white spruce, so we derive rules for where black and white spruce are found on the landscape. And then similarly for deciduous forest and shrub tundra, those are just combined into a deciduous vegetation type. So we also have rules for where those occur on the tundra and various other aspects as well, if you have any questions about that. So it's something that we don't advocate for using for what's truly on the ground, but as a model input, it's worked well for us. So outputs, I've touched on some of those and shared some data. This is showing fire scars. So on the left are the model simulated fire scars and then observed fire scars. So we have that sort of data, and that's been updated. I wouldn't say necessarily annually, but we have been updating that over time from the observed perspective. Burn severity, the age of the forest, land cover, biomass, mean annual ground temperature, active layer depth, and there's more as well. We have served up specific outputs, and then there's more that had come out of the model that can be made available by specifically speaking with us about it, and we can make those available. It is a lot of information. We have had requests, and we've sent out essentially a hard drive with terabytes of data because these are annual outputs, and it really adds up quickly. And then specifically for alfresco, we work with 200 model replicates. So if that's something that there's interest in using as well to really look at that variability with model outputs, it adds up quickly. And I'll say that although alfresco, we have 200 replicates, we work with what we call our best replicate, and that's what's used in the model. So moving forward, one of the efforts is that we want to take these model outputs, make them available, essentially take them off the shelf. There are those who can work with geotiffs and have that expertise, but there are others who do not, and this is where our IAM web app comes in. So there's this gap between the output availability and its actual use. So it's available, but not easily accessible to the non-technical user. So that is our goal for the web app. So we want users to visualize these outputs to learn if they're relevant for use in exercises such as climate impact and vulnerability assessments. This is the feedback that we're getting from the management community in Alaska, is that they really just need to see what these outputs look like to have a better understanding of whether it's something that they want to address in their particular national park or national wildlife refuge of interest. So really, is wildfire of concern for me, or I shouldn't say of concern, but this is something that we may have to adapt and consider in something like the Arctic Refuge over time. What sort of changes are within model projections, and we really just need to make these available so that managers can include them in their planning documents. So moving from our projections to things like influencing wildlife habitat. So we're building this web app. I don't know how relevant this is for those on the call, but we are looking for people to work with us on this from the management community or any other users to give their input. And we are soliciting input via a survey that we've put together, and we'll be sending that out in the next couple weeks. Really, like I said, to just understand priorities for what data is of interest and how to summarize those data, whether it be graphs, maps, tables, and what time slices are of interest. So perhaps for U.S. Fish and Wildlife, they may be interested in the next 30 years versus going all the way out to 2100. So summarizing data over shorter time slices, that sort of thing. And we are looking for people to work with us, and we're referring to it as a co-production team. We don't want to do this in isolation, complete the app, then make it available. We want to have it to be more iterative and be getting feedback as we're putting it together. And I will end there. I have not been tracking time, but I think we're doing pretty well. Good, so we've got 15 minutes for questions. And like I said, I really did go over this at a very high level, just in interest of keeping it short for this group. And I realized that you're also Arctic focused, and some of what I shared was more specific to the interior region. We have summaries available specifically for the Arctic, and that's could be summarized either Arctic LCC or whatever your specific area of interest is. We have it set up, at least within the IEM team, that we can, we have our outputs that are across the full IEM domain, but that we can pull out specific areas of interest as well and summarize results in that manner.
Thanks, Amy. And I will step in for Jeremy here and just open up the floor to questions. Either you can unmute yourself or you can type a question in the chat.
This is Lorene, and I have a question.
Sure.
So and maybe it's just because I don't fully understand it, just because I don't do the kind of work you do, but you know, you're using all these different, like, other people's research and models and stuff like that. And how do you make sure that the kind of the model parameters of the various disciplines you're using, that those inputs somehow work together so that you're not ending up with odd results when you blend or assess multiple models into this? Because it's a very big scope of what you're doing. So I'm just wondering how you assure that, like, everything's talking to each other and you don't have some weird oddball that's changing how you think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the models that we're working with, we do have the members of the IAM team. They are working specifically with those models. We're not taking something from elsewhere and incorporating it. We have the lead authors for each of those models as part of the team, even if there's been evolution in terms of retirement. So Dave McGuire with the TEM model, it's now being led by Eugenie and Ellen, for example, or Alfresco, we still have Scott Rupp, and then I'm the lead for Alfresco. So we are the lead authors for each of these models, so that's not a concern. But we typically have some kind of validation that's part of this, and we compare the historical to, so the simulated historical to the historical, and how well those two match help us to move forward, and whether we would, we're at a point where the model is parameterized well that we want to go forward with model projections. So I didn't show you specifically. Often what these look like are like a regression showing the historical on one axis and then the modeled historical on the other. And we do a simple regression, linear regression for how well they line up with one another. So I didn't share that with you, but there are a few examples, and this is not statistical, but more by eye. So I went back to this projection for wildfire. So Laureen, what we're looking at for the historical aspect is here for area burned, starting in 1950 through 2010, what does the historical look like and what does the simulated historical look like? And I could give you the, it's a non-parametric test that we use, like how we line these up and what we consider to be a good fit. But you can also somewhat do it by eye, so you can see that we're capturing that very high fire year that's up near 30,000 kilometers squared, or up near 7 million. That's about, I think that's probably 2015. And in general, we get it right. There are some areas like 1970. So the 70s were, this is actually, I was going to say the 70s were big in the Arctic. There was a lot of wildfire, but this is interior. In 1970, and I wish I could be pointing at this, the historical has there was a large area that was burned, but our simulated historical is not showing it as well. So it doesn't always overlap as well. but it's close enough, and we had confidence in going forward with the projections. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. And yeah, and I think it's interesting too, because you have both input models and output models. And I guess another question that pops up is, have you ever encountered something where you did have some strange anomaly and then you had to adjust things to make it match better?
We have, and we have some anomalies that we have not adjusted to make better. We just know they're there. So we have our inputs, and they are as good as what's made available. And for vegetation specifically, we created our own. For others, such as, I'm not showing all of them here. For something like soils and soil texture, we have a mosaic that has, for Alaska, relatively good resolution. And then as we go into Canada, if I were to show that to you, you could see quite well that the resolution changes considerably at that border. So we have less confidence on the Canadian side of the border. But for this, it's not something that you can necessarily see well, but we know in Southwest Alaska that the vegetation that's on the ground, what our understanding of permafrost, that it does not match well. And it's just something that's known. If we were to summarize for that particular area, what's actually on the ground does not match what our models are predicting. So there's some kind of mismatch. And so I said Southwest. Can you see my pointer?
Yes, we can.
Okay, yeah, so if we're looking like in this area down here, it shows that much of this area based on climate should either be discontinuous or no permafrost, but then there are areas where permafrost does occur, or based on climate, it also shows, our expectation is that there would be forest, and there is not forest in that particular area. And this is one known issue for the state of Alaska for our models. And we've just accepted it for that particular region, unless we want to delve deeper into our inputs for vegetation and for soil temperatures, for example, or active layer depth, that kind of thing. Other areas, it works relatively well. We know it works relatively well in Arctic, but there are just some areas of the state that climate is out of step with what's actually on the ground.
Excellent, thank you.
Are there other questions?
Maureen, do you think we could recruit you for a co-production team?
Yeah, probably. And I was just thinking that you need to meet Nick Jelensky, and I would like to connect you two.
Okay. just because you're asking, and this is the sort of thing we want fresh eyes asking these kind of questions, and it helps us to understand what we need to make available. And even just, it's one thing to have an app and to make data available in terms of something like spatial outputs and maps, but another in terms of like how to interpret those results, because there are caveats and there is uncertainty that's associated with our projections.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I completely agree, because especially when, you get it into broader hands and people who aren't researchers, you can end up with misinterpretations if it's not clear what it is you're actually presenting.
Yeah. And even just the scale. So if we look at something like an LCC region, we're relatively confident across that region that our summary is a good representation, but we don't want to get too small. And this is a question we often get, like, how small is too small? Like, we don't want to just focus on something like the village of Nome and just have something that's a very small region and summarize, because it may or may not be adequate. And we really don't have a good answer for how small is too small. And it's something that we could potentially address and in terms of scale, but we have not with the IEM. At least at this time, it has been done with other models, and really like at what level is it most appropriate, and the IEM is a landscape model. So we've had requests, for example, to summarize across watersheds and hucks, and once it gets down to a smaller scale, we really aren't as confident in our results. It needs to be not at a small watershed scale. And I'm not a hydrologist, but what the different levels of hucks are, but there's one that we've recommended, and I don't know it offhand, but we don't want to get too small. And we want to stay at that landscape level.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Other questions?
I'll tell you this FEE paper, the Frontiers in Ecology and Evolution, that's part of the Northern Test Case, the special issue. It's led by Gary Kofinas. I think it's a very good paper. Eugenie is the lead author, and we also worked with Kristen Tim before she started graduate work. She was the science communications lead at SNAP, and we were working with her on the co-production effort. So the lead authors, it's Eugenie, because she specifically works with EBSCOR. Neither Kristen or I do. So it was Eugenie, Kristen, and I that were essentially the lead authors on that paper. I think is very good, and we have a appendix that is our best summary of our IEM methods. There are a handful of accepted papers, but not enough for a special issue at this point, and it's been a few years in the making. I think it was accepted a year ago, so it's somewhat frustrating not to have that out there. But that would be something to look for, or I can share the accepted. I don't know that we have proofs, but we have the accepted, the manuscript. If there's interest, contact me, and I'm happy to share that.
And Amy, I would encourage you to, especially with this portion where you're asking for feedback and participation in the co-production team, posting that on the website might be helpful in drawing some people in. And if you could send me your slides, I will post those on the website as well. Are there any other questions for Amy? Well, thank you so much, Amy, for this great talk. And I think if you see places that IARPIC could help bring different agencies maybe into this discussion, we are happy to do that, or other ways that IARPIC could participate, please let us know. We're happy to be active in that way. And I'll also just plug one event that's happening tomorrow. We have I know this talk has been mostly about modeling, but we have a talk at 2 Eastern, 10 Alaska time tomorrow on being a woman in the field, the things no one tells you. So everyone, regardless of gender identity, is invited to participate, especially those who maybe oversee field work. Happy to have you. And with that, I'll close out the meeting unless there are any other thoughts.
Can I do one plug?
Yes, please.
As well. I'm putting this on my screen. I had intended to put this as my last slide, but some of you may know that I teach a summer field course in June, and I've been teaching it with Skip Walker. I've somewhat transitioned to teaching it on my own, but Skip will be joining this year again and is the lead. So we are going ahead with this summer just to get the word out. We had flyers at AGU, and we're going to be posting to some listservs. But just if you have students who are interested in the course, please have them get in touch with us. So they do need permission of the instructor to register, but registration is coming up at the end of January. So thank you for letting me give that plug, Meredith.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. And if you want to post that, it would be great on the IARPC website. I'm sure it would get a lot of attention.
Okay, thank you. I think I'm going to ask you and Jeremy how to do that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm happy to help with that.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thanks, everyone, for joining. And we will see you next time. We don't have our next meeting date or topic yet, but we will soon, so stay posted.
Thanks, Meredith.
Thank you.